What if I told you a unit of painters, sound engineers, and con artists defeated the German High Command without firing a single meaningful bullet? Not a movie plot, not a legend, real history. In 1944, deep in the forests and farmlands of wartime Europe, a group of 1,100 Americans did something that had never been done before in the history of warfare. They built an entire army out of thin air. Inflatable tanks that looked real enough to fool German reconnaissance planes. Massive speakers blasting the sounds of thousands of troops moving through the night. Radio operators so skilled they could impersonate entire divisions. And a cast of soldiers who walked into enemy-filled towns and performed a lie so convincing, German intelligence believed every word. This wasn't just deception. This was the greatest wartime performance in history. And for 50 years, nobody knew it happened. Welcome to the story of the Ghost Army, the world's most dangerous theater. To understand why the Ghost Army existed, you need to understand the impossible problem Allied commanders faced in 1944. The plan, the big plan, was to invade Nazi-occupied Europe through France. But here's the terrifying math. Germany had millions of troops spread across Europe. The Allies needed to move massive forces from point A to point B secretly, without Hitler's commanders figuring out where the real attack was coming from. If the Germans knew your true numbers, you were dead. If they knew your true location, you were dead. If they knew your true direction, the invasion failed, and potentially, so did the war. The Allies needed to appear to be in two places at once, to look bigger than they were, move faster than seemed possible, and keep the Germans constantly staring the wrong direction. In other words, they didn't just need soldiers, they needed illusionists, two unlikely men with an even more unlikely idea. Major Ralph Ingersoll was not your typical military officer. Before the war, he'd been the managing editor of The New Yorker, publisher of Fortune, and founder of an innovative New York newspaper. He referred to the unit he'd helped create as my con artists, calling it his only original contribution to the war effort. Colonel Billy Harris was the opposite, methodical, grounded, the man who figured out how to make wild ideas actually work. Inspired by British deceptions, especially Operation Bertram in North Africa, and wanting to give the American army every advantage when they went into France, these two planners dreamed up the Ghost Army and sold the idea to the top brass. Activated on January 20th, 1944, the Ghost Army arrived in Europe in May, shortly before D-Day, and returned to the U.S. at the end of the war in July 1945. And to staff it, the Army did something that had never been done before. They went to art school. Painters, designers, and con men in uniform. Picture this. You're a 19-year-old studying illustration at a Cleveland art college. It's 1943. The war is raging, and one day, you walk past the bulletin board and see a vague army notice looking for people with artistic skills. That was how Bernie Bluestein ended up in one of the most extraordinary and secretly dangerous operations of the entire war. He was all for serving his country, but not exactly the fighter-type person. He enlisted in the enigmatic unit. He didn't know it at the time, but the assignment would prove riskier than most non-combat roles. If the Nazis found out that members of the Ghost Army were playing them for fools, they were likely to retaliate brutally. The 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, the visual arm of the Ghost Army, recruited many of its men from institutions like Cooper Union and the Pratt Institute. Their talents equipped them for the wartime roles they assumed, and some went on to have extremely successful careers in art and design after the war. The Army wanted people who understood how things looked, because to fool a German reconnaissance pilot flying overhead, you didn't just need a fake tank, you needed one that cast the right shadow, sat at the right angle, and was imperfectly camouflaged. Just enough to be spotted. Too perfect? Suspicious. Too sloppy? Obviously fake. It required the eye of an artist. Fashion designer Bill Blass and painter Ellsworth Kelly were among the artists, ad men, radio broadcasters, sound experts, actors, architects, and set designers handpicked for the Ghost Army, which reportedly had one of the Army's highest collective IQs at a 119 average. Bill Blass, who would become one of the most iconic fashion designers in American history. Ellsworth Kelly, whose paintings and sculptures now hang in the world's greatest museums. Art Kane, a photographer who became a legend of rock and roll imagery. These weren't soldiers who happened to be creative. They were creators who happened to be soldiers. And they didn't just inflate fake tanks, they painted their way across Europe, sketching bombed-out churches, drawing portraits of fellow soldiers, capturing a continent on fire, all while living one of the most bizarre double lives in military history. By day, artists, by night, ghosts. But the Ghost Army wasn't one unit, it was four, each with a completely different weapon. The 603rd Engineer Camouflage Engineers, visual artists building and deploying inflatables. The Signal Company Special, radio operators impersonating real divisions over the airwaves. The 1332nd Signal Service Company, the sonic specialists with the most jaw-dropping tool of the war. And the 406th Combat Engineers, the fighters who kept everyone alive while the others performed. Together, they were about to pull off something the world had never seen.
3 tools that changed warfare forever. Let's talk about the tools, because these were not the weapons you'd expect. The most iconic weapon of the Ghost Army was also the strangest to behold. Inflatable rubber tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery, and even airplanes. Each inflatable Sherman tank weighed around 93 pounds and could be inflated in hours. From a German reconnaissance plane flying overhead, it looked exactly like the real thing. But here's the genius. The inflatable tanks were imperfectly camouflaged on purpose so they would be visible to enemy reconnaissance. Perfectly hidden tank raises suspicion. A mostly hidden tank looks real. So Ghost Army artists deliberately left a corner of the tread showing, a bit of the turret visible, just enough for a German pilot to feel like he'd discovered something. The men of the 406th frequently used their bulldozers to simulate tank tracks as part of the visual deception, creating evidence of armored movement that had never happened. That's not military strategy, that's theater direction. Now this is where things get genuinely mind-bending. Aided by engineers from Bell Labs, a team from the 3132nd went to Fort Knox to record the sounds of armored and infantry units onto a series of sound effects records that they brought to Europe. For each deception, sounds could be mixed to match the scenario they wanted the enemy to believe. This was recorded on state-of-the-art wire recorders, the predecessor to the tape recorder, then played back with powerful amplifiers and speakers mounted on half-tracks. These sounds were audible 15 miles away. 15 miles? That's not a speaker, that's a sonic weapon. For each mission, the sonic team mixed sounds like a recording engineer, adjusting levels, layering tracks, creating the exact audio portrait of whatever unit they were pretending to be. An entire 30,000-man force manufactured in the back of a truck, and they operated almost entirely at night because darkness makes the brain fill in visual details that aren't there. A soldier in a foxhole, hearing the unmistakable groan of enemy armor moving in the dark, doesn't reach for binoculars. He reaches for his radio, and he calls in a report about a division that doesn't exist. Radio deception was the most technically demanding tool of all. Every Morse code operator has a unique rhythm, characteristic speeds and pauses between letters like a fingerprint. German signals intelligence tracked these patterns. They could tell when a familiar operator vanished and a new one appeared. So Ghost Army radio men didn't just broadcast fake messages. Radio operators created phony traffic nets by spending weeks studying the target unit's actual operators, learning their cadence, their quirks, their habits, and then, when the real unit slipped away in the night, seamlessly continuing the radio traffic. German intelligence picks up the signals, same operator, same patterns. That division is still there. Meanwhile, the real division was 40 miles away, about to attack from a completely unexpected direction. 3 tools: visual, sonic, electronic.
Now it was time to use all three at once.
The roadshow goes to war. Ghost Army member Freddie Fox described his unit as a traveling roadshow that went up and down the front lines impersonating the real fighting outfits. The German army was their audience, and from the summer of 1944 through the final days of the war in 1945, they performed more than 20 shows across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. But this was no comfortable stage. The idea was to create a little unit of about 1,000 men and try to pretend they were a much larger unit, holding positions with just a few men. It was dangerous work because they didn't have the firepower to withstand a frontal attack. If the Germans ever called the bluff with a real assault, it would have been catastrophic. They knew this. They showed up anyway. The men immersed themselves in their roles, even hanging out at local cafes and spinning their counterfeit stories for spies who might lurk in the shadows. They wore the shoulder patches of whatever unit they were impersonating. They painted false division numbers on their vehicles. They set up fake command posts with fake generals. They even hung laundry on clotheslines near fake bivouac camps because a camp without laundry drying in the wind looks suspicious. Imagine the nerve. You're an art student from Brooklyn, sitting in a war-zone cafe in France, performing a character, knowing that if your cover breaks, there is no rescue coming. But the Ghost Army's most critical test was still coming. By early 1945, the Allied armies were pushing east toward Germany itself. The last great natural barrier was the Rhine River. Crossing it meant everything. The Germans knew it, and they had fortified its eastern bank, waiting. The U.S. Ninth Army needed to cross, but they needed to cross somewhere the Germans weren't watching. The plan: the Ghost Army would position itself 10 miles south of the real crossing point and make the loudest, most convincing noise of their entire war. The Ghost Army inflated 600 dummies and impersonated two divisions, 40,000 troops, to give the impression that the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions were amassing. Radio chatter spread false reports about their intended movements, and sonic trucks blasted a soundtrack of pontoon bridge construction, artillery fire, and even officers swearing. The Ghost Army stenciled fabricated division numbers onto their vehicles and erected phony headquarters and command posts manned by fake commanders and generals. In the darkness, for miles around, the German forces on the eastern bank heard exactly what they expected: an enormous American force assembling, bridge construction, armor staging, thousands of men getting into position. It wasn't real. Not one piece of it was real. German intelligence reported to the high command: massive Allied force preparing to cross at Viersen. German troops shifted south to meet them. While the Nazis attacked the Ghost Army, the Ninth Army crossed the Rhine with little resistance. When the Rhine River crossing occurred on March 24th against almost no opposition, it became clear that the 23rd's final performance was an impressive triumph. Operation Viersen was the Ghost Army's last performance. It was also their best.
Heroes who could never say a word. When the war ended in the summer of 1945, the Ghost Army packed up their inflatable tanks, handed over their sound effects records, and came home. And then they were told to be quiet. Not don't talk about it at the bar quiet, sworn to secrecy quiet, legally bound. The kind of quiet where you couldn't tell your wife, your parents, your children. Their story was kept a secret for more than 50 years after the war, until it was declassified in 1996. The military's reasoning: if the Cold War ever required a similar deception unit against the Soviet Union, they couldn't risk anyone knowing the playbook. So these men, who had saved an estimated 15,000 to 30,000 American lives, came home and said nothing. Bill Blass built a fashion empire. Ellsworth Kelly became one of the most celebrated painters of the 20th century. Art Kane created some of the most iconic photographs in music history. They gave interviews. They won awards. They told the stories of their lives. But there was one chapter, perhaps the most extraordinary chapter, that they couldn't touch for 50 years. Not a word. In April 1985, Smithsonian Magazine published the first public account of the group's exploits. Though knowledge of the 23rd became public then, it was still officially classified until the mid-1990s. The unit was the subject of a PBS documentary, The Ghost Army, in 2013. When filmmaker Rick Beyer finally told their story, some of
these men, now in their 80s and 90s, were speaking publicly about their wartime service for the very first time. The pride on their faces was something to see. The total human cost of Ghost Army operations: 3 men were killed in operations and 30 were injured by gunfire. 3 men killed for 20-plus deception operations conducted near active front lines with rubber tanks and speakers as their armor. 3. Compared to the 15 to 30,000 they are estimated to have saved, the math is extraordinary. What the Ghost Army teaches us. In February 2022, members of the Ghost Army were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal for their service. The surviving members, most in their 90s, received America's highest civilian honor, the recognition they should have gotten 75 years earlier. Better late than never, though barely. But here's why this story matters beyond the history books. Here's why it's worth knowing, not just as a war story, but as a lesson about how human beings solve impossible problems. The U.S. Army, in the middle of the deadliest war in human history, made a decision that sounds almost absurd. Let's hire artists, not as entertainers, as strategists. The Ghost Army worked because the people running it understood that perception is reality on a battlefield. What your enemy believes is happening shapes their decisions just as powerfully as what's actually happening. Both the psychological and information operations communities use the ghost patch as an informal identity, as these disciplines specialize in influence and deception activities, which the 23rd pioneered. The Ghost Army's legacy lives in every modern military that takes psychological operations seriously. We have a very specific picture of wartime heroism: a soldier in the line of fire, a medal for valor under direct combat. But what about the courage it takes to walk into an enemy-occupied cafe and perform a lie, knowing that if you flinch, there's no backup coming? What about operating speakers and inflating rubber tanks within artillery range of real German forces, protected only by the hope that they believe the illusion? What about 50 years of silence, sitting at dinner tables and in interviews while the world celebrated other heroes and yours remained invisible? The Ghost Army redefines what courage means. The Ghost Army's greatest weapon wasn't the speakers or the inflatable tanks. It was the German soldier's own mind. Every phantom division only succeeded because the enemy's brain did the rest, filled in the gaps, processed the sounds, completed the picture. The Ghost Army gave them just enough to build on. Sun Tzu wrote about this 2,500 years ago. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. The Ghost Army didn't overpower the Germans. They made the Germans defeat themselves by sending reinforcements to an empty position, by bracing for a crossing happening somewhere else. 1,100 men against millions. They won because they understood one profound truth: the battlefield of the mind is always the most decisive battlefield of all. The show must go on. Here is what I want you to carry with you from this story. In the darkest chapter of the 20th century, when the world was burning and the math of war seemed impossible, a group of painters and sound engineers and radio operators and architects looked at the problem in front of them and said, "We're going to solve this with imagination." They built armies from air. They conjured divisions from sound waves. They performed the greatest act of theater in military history in the mud and cold and dark of wartime Europe, with German artillery close enough to feel. They saved tens of thousands of lives, and then they came home and never said a word about it for 50 years. When Bernie Blunstein, one of the last surviving members, attended the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony in his late 90s and was asked what it felt like to finally be recognized, he smiled and he said simply, "It was about time." The Ghost Army was classified for half a century, but the lesson they left us cannot be classified. Creativity is not the opposite of strength. It is strength. Imagination is not the opposite of strategy. It is strategy. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in war, in business, in life is make someone believe in something that isn't there yet. Because what we believe shapes what we do, and what we do changes everything. If you found this story as extraordinary as I do, share it, because the Ghost Army spent 50 years in silence, and their story deserves to be loud. Drop a comment. Which part amazed
amazed you most? The inflatable tanks? The sonic deception? The artists who never got to talk about it? And if you haven't subscribed yet, there are more stories like this one waiting. History's most remarkable chapters, the ones that got buried, the ones that deserve a second look. Hit subscribe. We're just getting started.